Recently, I've been dipping my toes into alternative 1v1 formats, Canadian Highlander, Modern, Pauper, etc., and it's allowed me to view the entirety of Magic the Gathering through a very different lens, and that's because I was largely onboarded to the game through the Commander format, and I'd wager that many of you were probably the same. Now, deck construction principles and game mechanics largely come from these 1v1 formats. After all, the dominant way to play Magic the Gathering was 1v1, and that lasted for many decades before Elder Dragon Highlander really became popular. Now, there's so much advice floating out there regarding the best deck building principles, and sometimes it feels completely overwhelming unless you've spent countless hours playing, testing, retesting, hypothesizing, failing, and then going all the way back to the beginning time and time again. And that's where I would like to actually step in and help. I want you to better understand what advice is actually useful to us as deck builders, and also the age-old advice that can simply be left behind. You start off your turn one with a Jackal Familiar, a 2/2 that needs something to attack along with it in order for it to actually attack. Your opponent responds on their turn by simply playing an Elvish Mystic. Now back to us, we flame jab the Elvish Mystic and then play out a Goblin Sledder, which allows us to sacrifice a Goblin to give a creature +1/+1 until end of turn. Now we can't attack yet, so we have to pass back to our opponent. Your opponent's turn 2 is an Elvish Vanguard, and when it comes back to us, we attack for 3 before playing out our Goblin Sparksmith, missing our land drop. The board state gets more complicated with the Elvish Vanguard getting buffed and multiple creatures coming into play for the support of our opponent. But luckily, we are untapping with our Sparksmith, allowing us to destroy the larger Elvish Vanguard and then beating in for another 3 damage. Our opponent takes a cue from us, missing their land drop and only playing out a Timberwatch Elf before passing. Luckily, we were smart, keeping mountains in hand to cast Flame Jab from the graveyard with its retraceability, clearing the way for our attackers to deal another 6 damage. Our opponent's life total is dwindling at 8, and a quick look at the board state shows us in very good standing. Removal on the board, removal in hand, and our deck is chocked full of burn and more dumb idiots to get through for the win. And that's actually what happens the very next turn, cementing our win with a lightning bolt to the face ×2. Now, what you just watched was a reenacted game from the Card Market YouTube channel. It was the deciding semifinal match to send Goblins all the way to the finals bracket. This game also allows us to demonstrate some points which oftentimes go missed among Commander players, and myself included, especially in the beginning stages when I was trying to grapple with the complexity of this game. Parody is used to describe a game state whereupon all the players at the table are unable to establish a dominant, also known as a winning type of position. Now, with a game that we just watched, the Goblin deck never wants you to reach a state of parity. The red deck always wants to keep you on the back foot at all times, pressing its advantage until you break. And to the credit of the Elf player, they were probably simply 1 card or even 1 mana away in some cases from stabilizing the game, reaching parity, but one of the major parity breakers of that game was the Goblin Sparksmith, allowing the board to remain clear for the little guys to get through and attack in for lethal. You see, when parity doesn't exist, that means that someone is in the driver's seat. They are winning. And in the game of Magic the Gathering, especially in 1v1 formats, in order to have a winner, you must have some loser. Somebody has to lose the game. This directly ties into the popular evaluation method for Magic the Gathering, also known as Quadrant Theory. Now, Quadrant Theory, originally coined by Brian Wong for MTG purposes, is a method for card evaluation and game state understanding that breaks these concepts into 4 quadrants. Now, there is of course parity, but there's also winning and losing. This means that we're only missing one thing from this quadrant theory, which is the opening or the development phase. Now, this is the part of the game where players establish themselves as either the Goblin deck, which is going to be the aggressor in the circumstance, or the Elf deck, which is the defender in the circumstance. And the opening phase is massively important in determining a winner. After all, if the Elf deck had gone first, that means that there was a good chance the Goblin Sparksmith would not have been online at the key times that the red deck needed in order to press the advantage and also get the win. And luckily, this can also translate into games of Commander. More on that later. As we just saw in the game, parity breakers allow you to win. You need something that lets you convert your existing board state or game plan into a win. I think the easiest example of this for Commander is a board full of elves coupled with a Craterhoof Behemoth. Now, the Behemoth simply rewards us for playing out all those existing elves, which you want to be doing anyway for synergistic reasons. But if you are running a parity breaker in the form of an alternative win condition, such as, let's say, an Epic Struggle in the instance of the elf deck, you're representing what we in the business call a win more card, something that without plenty of support in an already winning game state will do little to nothing to affect the overall outcome of the game that you're in. I'd argue that a Craterhoof Behemoth in a creature-heavy deck will have much more versatility and present wins much more consistently than an Epic Struggle. After all, if we do have 20 creatures on board, we're already in a winning position for that game, and the Behemoth at this point is simply complementary to our strategy, and it's not contingent on a set number of things to actually occur for us to actually win that game. The same is true for Helix Pinnacle, which is run mostly in decks that make excessive mana, and it acts as sort of a mana sink where you can dump mana into it when you don't need it. Think about the mono green Omnath or a Krufix God of Horizons. But here's the thing, if you need 100 mana to sink into this thing over the course of the game, there's a very good chance the only possible way you get there is with infinite or near infinite mana production. And couldn't you include a different card that allows you to win the game more reliably with near infinite mana? Just think about it. We only need to win here. We don't need to win more. In this specific circumstance, we're basically talking about payoffs. And in the average game of Commander, we have plenty of cards that I would either classify as an enabler, which is something that gets our strategy rolling and is supportive to our end goal, or a payoff, which is something that rewards us for playing those other synergistic pieces in our deck. Again, this is basically the elves to your Craterhoof Behemoth or the goblins to your Goblin Sparksmith. These are just very basic examples. But this is also where we get our very first big road bump in this video, which is simply the extremely high level of complexity that goes into the average game of Commander. If we assume that everybody at the table is actually trying to win this game and they have a similarly optimized deck list, that means that we have a roughly 25% chance of winning the game just by entering into this pod. But that's inherently different than a 1v1. In a 1v1 game in similar circumstances, with all things equal, the estimated win percentage is much closer to 50%, which is startlingly higher than the aforementioned 25. The odds are suddenly much less in your favor the moment that we add more people to our group. Similarly, you can pilot a mono-red goblin deck in Commander, and many people do, but the moment that the red deck has to worry about 2 more players and all of their life totals eclipsing the 20s that we get in 1v1 formats, it suddenly becomes a much bigger challenge. As my friend Elijah put it, it's much harder in Commander to ride being aggressive in the opening phase all the way to a victory due to the multiplayer 40 life per player nature of the format. If one player starts out particularly strong and aggressive in casual Commander, the other 3 players are likely going to gang up on them and correct their behavior. And this isn't even considering the hidden contracts or the social element of the game being prioritized over winning for many people, or the inability of certain people to properly summarize the power level of their deck, which makes a Rule 0 discussion much more difficult, the wide variance of card selection in our deck because we are running a 100-card singleton deck in a singleton format, the increased life totals of all of our opponents, and a litany of other issues and complicators. Now, I don't want to scare you away from watching the rest of this video. Quite to the contrary, I think that this acts as a very good foundation for us to actually build off of. Once we understand that certain elements of the game are translatable to Commander, such as parity, breaking parity, and of course our payoffs, we can begin to understand the fundamentals that will become our deck building principles that ultimately should translate to us winning more games. And I have a few caveats at the end, so look forward to those. So let's start by talking about deck building. Now, my deck building philosophy is largely focused around a top-down style, even if I don't outright express it in the videos that everybody's been watching. For example, when I look at a commander, I will break it down into its component parts to determine my build path. A super easy example of this is actually Prosper Tomebound, who rewards you for casting from exile by making treasure. Simple. Exile things and then use the treasure to fuel more of your exiling effects. And best yet, Prosper does it for you. But breaking down the component parts of the deck does so much more than just tell you how the deck works. It also gives you the roadmap to identify the methods by which we need to build each individual commander deck. Sure, on the face, Prosper really only cares about you casting from exile, but subtly, he also wants to reward you for using those treasure tokens that you generate. Think about a Marionette Master or a Reign of Riches. He also plays into existing archetypes that are not immediately obvious, such as as a cascade theme or deck theft. And to push this even further, the treasures that Prosper generates tells us so much more about how we need to approach our deck build. A treasure token is an artifact, yeah, but it's also a token, which matters for plenty of cards that care about tokens being made or sacrificed. This narrative has suddenly shifted into something more complex, and this is the conundrum of the average deck builder for Commander. How do you filter through what is actually important and what can be left on the cutting room floor? What is actually worth your time to consider as the deck builder? Now, this discussion about inclusions can be beautifully summarized and illustrated by talking about removal spells. And you don't need me to tell you to actually run more removal, but you may need help to identify the type of removal that makes it into your Commander deck. And running enough removal is actually a tale as old as time. After all, we are in a 4-player format, but single target removal, although important, can sometimes actually detract from your game plan. Let me explain. For every single instance of a single target removal card in our deck, such as a Swords to Plowshares, for example, we are foregoing including another card that could have filled that slot, be it something like a land or an enabler or a payoff of some kind. You get the picture. And moreover, we're in a multiplayer format, so one-for-oneing an opponent with a Swords to Plowshares implicitly means that you are putting the other two players at the table ahead on card advantage. And over the course of the game, if this were to continue, this adds up in some really major ways. Now, one of my friends is really great at deck construction, and he runs plenty of single target removal, but if he's the only person that's policing the board that game, this results in frequent situations where the other players are slowly, incrementally, getting ahead over the course of the game. And he still does win quite a bit because having good, efficient removal in your deck is ultimately something that's very important, but he also ensures that he's running plenty of card advantage pieces and draw engines to support the addition of extra single targeted removal in his deck. Now, this is also why mass removal printed on a single card like Cyclonic Rift is at such a premium in our format. You oftentimes are 1-for-20ing or more your opponents, which is often enough to break the parity of that game state and allows you to proceed to a win. But I also want to be very clear and state that you don't want to be filling your entire deck with board wipes just because it has the higher chance of going card positive across the table. Yes, this does matter sometimes, but we don't always need to solve every situation with a hammer. Sometimes we really do need a scalpel. Now, I do think that single-sided board wipes have a much better place in Commander, and single-sided, for those of you that aren't aware, are the ones that effectively leave your board state untouched while wiping away your opponents. Think about a card like Kindred Dominance. First, as mentioned for a single-sided board wipe previously, it has a much higher propensity to go card positive, destroying 8, 10, 20 things all for the price of one card, and that's really good. And second, and maybe even more importantly, it doesn't actually grind the game to a halt the way that a total board wipe will. It allows you to maintain a board position and go from a state of parity to a winning state pretty much immediately, and that can be majorly effective when deployed correctly. But let's talk about the bread and butter of our deck production. Our deck building process should be one that rewards us for including enough of the enablers in our list to the benefit of the payoffs. Think about having more cohesiveness in the deck on the build-up, leading to our finish. Now, this is where it gets complicated, and it's actually where I stumbled with plenty of my deck builds in the past. I don't want us to get so caught up on the premise of quadrant theory evaluation of our deck builds that we start to lose focus on what the deck actually wants us to do. Unfortunately, in Commander, it's so much more difficult to evaluate individual cards on this quadrant axis, and quite frankly, it's also very draining to do so. For example, a Soul Sister card, which there will be some up on screen now, can be good in all phases in Commander, and admittedly, some more than others. This is just an example. You can play it out early to sort of mitigate life loss and set yourself up. That's the development phase. It's also good in the parity phase to sort of slow things down or take over with your higher life total. And again, sometimes it's a synergy piece, but it's also good in winning situations because oftentimes there are combos existing with Soul Sisters, which basically allow you to break the game wide open. But you could also argue that it's good in the losing phase as well, because it helps mitigate your life loss and potentially acts as a good blocker in those situations as well. You can sit and argue literally for days about certain cards and about when they are most optimal in a game of Commander, because our format inherently makes this type of card evaluation much more difficult. And let me be clear, I'm not saying impossible, and I'm not saying that it's not useful. I'm just saying it makes it much more difficult and can be a drain on you, the deck builder, when you're making individual niche card choices for your deck. So this is really the tricky thing. How do you as the deck builder make the proper determination about what quadrant you should be concerned about? Now, let's not overcomplicate things. In fact, let's just focus on the development phase and also the parody phase, because those tell us a lot about how our deck is going to be built. These are more or less translatable to the enablers and payoffs that allow our deck to actually function and win games. Unfortunately, payoffs come in all different types and sizes. Using Prosper as an example again, a Rain of Riches or a Torment of Hailfire do very different things to end the game, but they could be equally likely to end the game depending on your version of the deck and the situation that the board state has presented. And this goes even deeper. Oftentimes, this type of card choice is based on your present meta. If someone in your group is always in blue and they're running tons of counter magic, a Torment of Hailfire in the late stage of the game may be expected, and the counter magic may already be held up, which would make something like an existing Rain of Riches on the battlefield a superior option for your group. I would argue it's much more important to strive for some internal consistency with your payoffs in your deck rather than simply accrue various different methods to win the game. Or if you're simply unfamiliar with the meta in your area, it's probably better to do this as well. And this is where things like redundant effects come into play. For example, if we have a lot of different effects that are the payoff, let's call them, of pinging down our opponents by sacrificing or making tokens, well, that's a great build path because it means the enablers in our list, the things that we're putting in there to generate or propagate more tokens, also benefit and are focused to that end. This also gives your deck some more internal consistency across the board, and it should allow your deck to also function without your commander. And if you want to see a whole video on that, you can check out my other video on that topic. Now let's bring it all home. If we have more internally consistent payoffs in the deck, it makes breaking parity that much easier. Whether you're the red deck crashing in for early beats and then unsettling your opponents with low life totals, or you're opting for more of a control heavy shell, opting for longer games where you can control the state and flow of the game, they both become much more consistent when our end goals are also more consistent. And let's not mince words. What I'm implying here is that good focus on how we plan to win our game leads to us developing a better understanding of how we need to actually build our deck. The deck building process is where we're going to win a majority of our games. We've done a lot of talking about payoffs, but indirectly, you've also been learning a lot about the enablers and the consistency pieces that actually benefit our payoffs. If we're mostly focused on making treasure and then sacrificing it, like in the instance of Prosper Tomebound, I can think of tons of efficient and consistent cards that allow us to make that happen, which by proxy means that when we get to our payoffs, we're going to be able to deploy them that much more easily. Now, let's just give a few real life examples of how this works outside of Prosper, because for me at least, I'm definitely more of like a visual learner and I want to actually see the cards in other circumstances. That way I can better understand the concept. So let's first start off by talking about Tivit, which is basically an Esper Sphinx commander that relies on entering the battlefield and then attacking to generate additional tokens for yourself. On the surface, our goal is to abuse that token generation with effects like a Cyberdrive Awakener or a Rise and Shine, a Tangled Trove Kelp, or in the classic example, Time Sieve, which basically allows you to take infinite extra turns. And there's a lot of things that allow us to get there. So things that help us make more tokens are really the enablers in our list. So things like Academy Manufactor, Anointed Procession, or other doublers to make that game plan happen. Feather the Redeemed is another very interesting example. It's basically Boros Spellslinger or Boros cantrips. So in a way, you could argue that the cantrips are essentially the enablers, but it goes a little bit deeper than that. When we're looking at how we want to end the game, we need to be thinking about effects like Monastery Mentor or Kessig Flamebreather, Firebrand Archer, Electrostatic Field, all the things that are going to ping down our opponents or make tons of tokens to overwhelm the board as a result. And yes, the cantrips do matter, but we need to be able to continuously cast them. So things like, let's say, Burgi or a Stormkiln Artist or a Runaway Steam Kiln or Zadahedron Grinder go a very long way to ensure that we are able to meet that goal. So this has already been a long video and I don't want to linger long on this final point, but I think it's very important. So listen up. This entire video, I have assumed that you want to win games. More importantly, you want to win Commander games. But I have to pose this question. Do 1v1 formats have the same goal as Commander? Or maybe a better way to ask it would be, do 1v1 formats and Commander have the same end goal of winning? On the surface, the answer is obviously yes. Like in Commander games, we designate those whose life total has gone to 0 or lower as someone who has lost. And typically, the person who's last standing in the field of corpses is deemed the winner. Those are literally the words that we use. But not everyone who plays this game specifically has the same end goal of winning in mind. Sometimes the goal is to surprise people with a new creative deck build, or maybe play a suboptimal 7-card combo because they just find it funny. Insert the, oh my god, I've never done this before type of moments at your tables. Or maybe they play simply because that's what their friends do, and they just want to be with their friends, and that's really not so bad, is it? And if that last one is you, I salute you and hope to see you at some of my tables. And even more complicated than all this, I would wager at least, is that winning means something different for every individual person. Sure, a one-sided slaughter technically is a win, but you may not feel as if you've won. In fact, you might actually feel the opposite, as if you've cheated or brought too strong of a deck to your table. I certainly have felt this way before. In fact, the times that I feel as if I've won a game of Commander is when I reach the end of a long but very close race and either barely eke out the win or barely lose. That to me feels like winning. And this also means that my deck construction may somewhat suffer because I'll leave out more of the powerful or consistent cards in favor of more suboptimal, but also very fun to play with cards. It makes not just my experience better, but the entire table's experience better. So what can you actually take away from this video? First and foremost, Quadrant Theory, although a better diagnostic tool for 1 versus 1, is still applicable in Commander and can be a damn good way to evaluate your card choices. Think about if the card is good at breaking parity. Oftentimes that's your disruptive pieces or your payoffs to run over the table. But also consider the development stages of your game, allowing you to set yourself up better, often with your enablers to be in a more winning position when the time comes. Second, forget everything I just said about the first takeaway, or maybe don't, but you should always keep in mind that the easy to evaluate cards in a 1v1 format using Quadrant Theory are not actually a 1-to-1 comparison for Commander most of the time. Sometimes cards will fall into multiple different categories and become very difficult for you to gauge as a result due to the 4-player nature of our format. And it's just difficult to evaluate it on that axis. Or another way to say it, or to quote Kurt Vonnegut, perhaps a real masterpiece cannot be crucified on a cross of this design. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the identification of your deck build path, which is aided by everything that we just talked about, is paramount. You should seek to have great internal deck consistency if your goal is to win, and using this evaluation method can be majorly helpful to get to that end goal. And don't waste your time with excess. The epic struggles and helix pinnacles of the world are sexy, yes, but as I've stated before, you do not need to be sexy to win a game of Commander. You just need to have a better, ideally more consistent game plan than your opponents. Finally, because of the nature of the format, you are ultimately the one who decides what it feels like to win. Now, if your end goal is to have a fun time playing with your friends, then use this video to identify what a strong build for your Commander looks like, and then dial it back to fit the needs of your group. That way, you're going to have a much better experience playing with your lower powered friends, and hopefully they'll enjoy your deck too. Or actually disregard this whole video because it was just a bunch of philosophical mumbo jumbo. You do you. I hope that you found this video helpful. I want to give a huge shout out to my friends Elijah and Jacob. Friends first, editors second for this script. Without you guys, the script and the video wouldn't have been nearly as good as it turned out, so thank you so much for that. I also want to majorly thank those of you that stuck around all the way to the end of this video and watched it all the way through. This was a big lift for me to complete with the new production methods, including the aforementioned editing process, so thank you to you as well. If you're interested in the channel and doing more of this style of video, please subscribe and also go check out my Patreon down in the description below. Coming in just the next few months will be a brand new gameplay series called Commander Showdown, hosted by myself and also my soon-to-be partner and wife, and you're not going to want to miss it. If you found this video helpful or have something else to add to the discussion, I would love to hear it down in the comments below, and also share it with friends who you think will find this type of video helpful. As always, I hope that you continue to have more and better games of Commander, and I will see you very soon for another video. Bye, guys.